Do subscribe to my YouTube channel for some hot disability charcha and for juicy gender gupshup. Press the bell icon to keep hearing from your neighborhood disabled feminist.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nishtha.
And I am Pragya.
And we're your hosts for the podcast Intersectional Feminism Desi Style, brought to you by Feminism in India. Today, Pragya, do you want to tell our listeners what we're going to be talking about today?
Yes, so today we are going to talk about disability. So, disability as a category of intersectionality is often seen as an afterthought. This is something that a lot of people with disabilities and disability rights activists have repeatedly pointed out. And despite the increasing movement for disability rights, people and especially women with disabilities are not given leadership positions in most sectors. Most of our work is often done in public places and offices, but these are seldom equipped with features that will, infrastructure that will facilitate people with disabilities. Added to that is obviously the anxiety that most women, or I could actually just say all women, and people from gender minority groups face on a daily basis in public spaces. So there is a dire need to first sensitize people about these kind of challenges that people with disabilities and specifically women with disabilities have to confront every day, and then also push towards policy making that could make these spaces more accessible to women with disabilities in particular. So yeah, so we will be talking about public spaces and how women with disabilities navigate through public spaces, and how citizens who are listening to us, our listeners today, could take some notes on how we could do more for people with disabilities and in policy making as well as in general sensitizing capacities.
And joining us today for our conversation is a very special guest. We have with us today Nidhi Goyal, who's the founder and director of Rising Flame, which is an NGO working for the rights of people with disability, especially women and youth. In addition to being a disability rights activist, Nidhi also is the youngest and first person with disability to become the president of the Association for Women's Rights and Development. She's been at the helm of training programs focused at the intersections of disability, gender, violence, and sexuality. And she can leave you in splits because she happens to be a stand up comedian as well. Nidhi, thank you so much for being here with us today. We're so excited to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Nishta and Pragya, for inviting me into this fantastic show. Desi Style, I love the name.
Nidhi, because we are talking about public sphere today and public spaces, for women, public space has been a very double-edged sword, I feel. It is obviously the space where most people see empowerment, liberation, because most offices and work is beyond our houses. Of course, there is domestic work, and that also needs equal amount of acknowledgement. But often the public space is a tricky domain where it is often seen as empowering for women, and yet it poses so many challenges around safety, accessibility of roads, and services, etc. And for women with disabilities in particular, the same situation might become even more challenging. As a disability and gender rights activist, what are the kinds of difficulties you have faced or heard other women with disabilities face? And how do you think that this public can be made more available to women with disabilities?
Thank you so much, Pragya, for that question. Our understanding of access is important to make public spaces accessible for women, right? Understanding of what access means for genders, understanding what access means for people with disabilities, understanding what access would mean for anyone living with a diversity. And diversity is not fixed. There's a understanding that, okay, acha, I am not disabled, but tomorrow you may just fracture your foot and be temporarily disabled, right? Or something else may happen. So I think the first I want to start by why access is important. And access to public spaces, of course, in this whole spectrum, but the reason that access is important, and the reason that disability rights speaks about universal access, is that when you do and have an accessibility solution, or make a place accessible, or service accessible, transportation accessible, it is universal. So it just does not just support or enable people with disabilities. It would then, to give a simple example of stairs and ramps, because most people understand that, young children, toddlers use ramps, pregnant women use ramps, older people use ramps. You may just be extremely tired one day and you would prefer the ramp over steps. So thinking about access as a universal access is first of all really important. And then when you think about public spaces, and access to these public spaces, what access looks like for women with disabilities is extremely important to look at, because it's a little more nuanced than what you would just think for women or just think for people with disabilities. It's really this confluence of, in a very simplified way, accessibility and safety both. And they have a huge sort of linkage, right? A very deep linkage that they have. Often the violence, the public space harassment stories that you'll hear from women with disabilities are because things were inaccessible. So when a blind woman offers her arm or holds onto someone else's arm to cross the street, she's making herself more vulnerable to direct touch, to direct abuse. When a wheelchair user has to be lifted into some place, when the wheelchair has to be lifted and put into a bus, we're opening ourselves to abuse, right? We're increasing the vulnerability. And so for women with disabilities, access to public spaces would definitely include accessibility, would definitely include safety. And when we look at it, it's not two separate components. They are weaved in together in a more nuanced fashion.
Right. Nidhi, what you pointed out, it actually, when we were conducting our research, I came across an interview where you had also mentioned that the whole concept of consent, when it comes to people with disabilities, becomes very different from, say, what popular media would have us to believe is always sexual consent or romantic consent. So I think that does definitely tie in with what you just spoke about. So in this show, what's a constant effort on our part is to always try to unwrap and take a look at how different identities overlap to contribute to a person's lived experiences. So one thing that we really wanted to know is, how does caste, class, and gender influence people with disabilities and their access to public spaces? And can you tell us how intersectionality plays out within people with disabilities, and how this really then decides their mobility and access to public spaces?
I'd like to step back and respond to one of the things that you were just mentioning around consent. And I think it's again very interesting because when people with disabilities, I think one of the biggest stigma that they carry is of infantilization, or the stigmatized attitude that they have to, behavior that they have to face is of infantilization, right? And so non-disabled folks are constantly, and when I say non-disabled folks, it's not you and Pragya, it's just in general, right? I'm using a general statement. Majority of the behaviors are around infantilizing people with disabilities, which means when you immediately infantilize someone, which means you're making them childlike. What do children not have? The agency. For us, as a society, legally, what do children not have? The ability to consent. And I'm not talking as an activist, as a feminist, or as a child rights activist. I'm talking about a general perception of children, right? Like how legally, how you can never consent, you can never have a contractual obligation. Socially, you're like, this one's a child, why do you want to ask them? We can just decide on behalf of them. So by these attitudes and legalities, we take away the agency, the autonomy, the choice and consent, all of people with disabilities, right? And so suddenly you'll find a 20-year-old person with a disability not being asked before being dragged somewhere, or not being checked, or requested or asked or encouraged before eating something. Like I generally say, when I go to public conferences, etc., and if someone's assisting me, it's very interesting how I will ask for 3 things, and then when my plate comes, there are 7 or 3 different things. And if I get upset, people around me are really upset because they're like, oh, someone's helping you, just be grateful and be done with it. If you ask for 3 and someone gave 7, it's fine. But what we're constantly doing with this kind of behavior is are a couple of things, and I'm sorry I'm deviating from your intersectionality question, but I think this is extremely important to understand. Where, from this example, I can tell you there are two things. One, you dismiss what the person with a disability wants. So they can't decide, they can't choose, right? So there's no question of consent then. And the second, what we're doing is we're constantly telling a person with a disability, at least someone's doing this. Come on. Like, at least someone helped you. Why do you want to protest, right? And when these kinds of behaviors or stigma or discrimination lands on a person with a disability, and these are the narratives, the dominant narratives around them, they kind of start internalizing it. So often street sexual harassment for women with disabilities is extremely difficult to identify as street sexual harassment. It becomes a disability harassment. And as soon as you shift that and remove the street sexual harassment bit, or like, that's why you don't have access to spaces. The minute you remove that, it stops being a feminist issue. It becomes, oh, that's disability because they're disabled, right? So there's a constant blame on the disability. There's a constant, it's very similar to how women are like, yeah, you deserve it. You did this, that is why. You went out at night, so it's your behavior that's responsible for this abuse. And for women with disabilities, it's like your disability is responsible for the abuse. It's nothing to do with you're a woman. And this constant ungendering also. So there are so many layers to this safety in public spaces, or to have a good public access experience, are so many, because it comes from this whole space of, oh, you're not a woman enough, who's going to actually harass you? Like, what are you even talking about? Why should we safety? When we say all women should be safe, even as feminists, does an image of a disabled woman come to our mind? And it's an honest question for everyone to reflect. Some could obviously say, of course it comes. Like, there's no question. Don't try to act smart. But this is a question for each of us to reflect, that women from where come to our mind, right? When we say that there is an abusive behavior, it's very similar to, and it cuts across, right? When we say, oh, domestic violence, immediately people be like, oh, they're not well-to-do people. They live in slums and all. And I'm again using very common everyday language, because we think domestic violence is class-based, right? And a lot of people think that. We think safety of public spaces is for working women because they get out. But then we are totally killing the idea of loitering. We're totally doing away with the idea of hanging out, chilling, accessing space like it's your own. So women across different identities, when we say it should be safe and accessible for all women, the first major question is, who are these all women that we're talking about? Who comes to our mind when we say all women? Right? Which areas, when we say public spaces, are we only looking at neatly trimmed lawns in probably South Delhi or Central Delhi? Or are we thinking of, Nariman Point in Mumbai? Do we think of that public space, a common square, which is where a lot of women from the chawls hang out or need to access these spaces, or near an urban slum? Do we think circle near the urban slum, which is a hotspot for like golgappa and pani puri and junk food, right? So I think for us, when we stand at different intersections, or we don't occupy certain intersections, our understanding of public space as well as all women both get very, very skewed, or skewed to a certain extent, right? I don't know if I confused you more, or I sort of added a layer to the conversation, but I really wanted to bring that up for us to even reflect.
Thank you for that, Nidhi. I'm actually going to go back to an earlier question that you had said, that many a times people with disabilities are infantilized, and that takes away from their consent and from their agency. Now, when we were actually researching for this episode, I went and I listened to a lot of your stand-up pieces. So I'm also coming from a fangirl perspective. But one recurring theme, not just in your work that I came across, but also, I mean, feminism in India has a whole host of work that's hosted on this, which is the entire trope of inspiration porn. and how often persons with disabilities are put up on a pedestal. Can you just shed some light uh, on why this perception of person with disabilities can be harmful and problematic, especially when, again, coming back, it comes to representation in public spheres?
Okay, should I turn this around? Should I interview you both for a bit? Spontaneously. Um, do you remember many, I mean, even now it continues, for many years, women have been called devis, goddesses, superwomen, and why is it a problem?
Again, I mean, it's just this strange dehumanizing expectation that we're only present for like one thing. Like in a technical term, that's almost like benevolent sexism, where you sort of club and categorize women into this one person, and if they are not that, if they are not a devi, if they are not a goddess, then they are bad women. And so you either have devi or you have bad women, and there is no sort of space in between. I mean, that's the way that I view it.
Yeah, because the treatment in real life is not the same. It's just a romantic way of thinking about women and portraying them in a way that to imply that the society in general really respects women. But all of these are really romantic categories of describing women. But in real life, it's so much different. There is so much gap between what is preached and what is practiced.
Brilliant. So I'm just going to take both these answers and explain to you why inspiration porn is difficult, right? When you call someone you're so inspiring, it's just something that you say, right? You don't really, like you said, the behavior in real life is really not the same. You really don't think that people with disabilities are, you know, amongst the capable of our lot, right? Our lot is the main thing to remember. It is to put someone on a pedestal. What happens when you put someone on a pedestal? They don't become ours. Like, they're not like ours, or they're not like us. They're someone above us. They're like, amazing, this is too good, this is too good. But we're normal people. And this is to raise someone out of the normal box, right? And that's the real problem. The second thing is what you said, Nishta, that this is an ideal and you should really be there. So for people with disabilities, you're either inspiring or you're a loser. Okay. I mean, something, an object of pity. There's nothing in between. You can't be an average disabled person. And I kept saying this all through my college or later in my post graduation. I was like, can I just be an average disabled student or something like that? Like, can, why is there no right to be an average student? Because I live with a disability, right? Either I have to be like this, oh my God, I struggle a lot to pass, or wow, look, in spite of her disability, she also can do this, right? um, and it is a lot of condescension. It comes from a space of, we don't realize because it's about thing that people use it for, but it also comes from a space of, you're not like us. One, um, you're either this or you're totally dropped, so we put you above normal or below normal. You're not normal. Third, now because you're this super normal person, and that's what is with super women, devi, mahan, goddess, etc., etc., is that now you don't need any support from us. So there is no responsibility from people around. The all the onus of your safety, of your mental health, of excelling, of balancing family and work, of like living, of being this ideal person, all the onus is on you. So it's a very, very easy route to take. Um, because then suddenly society has no onus. They can stigmatize you, but you've combated that. They can create barriers, but you've gone beyond that. They can be unhelpful and purposely discriminatory. You don't care about them. You just looked at your goal. They could abuse you, but you are, you know, you find your own ways. Like things like that, right? It's the onus on you. Because society doesn't want to engage with you, government, state doesn't want to engage with you, doesn't want to provide that support. So it's a very clever rouge to say you're not like us and you're basically a problem, but in a positive way. I do want to also say that while I say this, and I objected, I was at the Internet Governance Forum in France. pre-COVID times in Paris, and somebody after my talk came and said, "You were so inspiring." And and she probably, like you, Googled me up, and then she came back to me after some time and she said, "Listen, like when I said you were inspiring, I didn't mean like you as a person. What you spoke about, your expertise, the points that you made were really inspiring for my activism." And so there is also this thing that because of this kind of overarching stigma or condescension that people with disabilities face, we're like, we're not inspiring, just keep quiet, right? So but someone's work can be inspiring. And a simple way to look at it is, the day you think people with disabilities are your competition, you're already putting them in your category. I think that's the easiest thing to say, right? Because you often are like, what can they do? Or like, wow, they're beyond us, forget them.
Okay, so that was something also I had in my head actually today, because I think I know you from 1 year. I've followed your work and everything, and I just love the way you talk and the way whatever you say, it's so in depth and gives me so many new perspectives. And I do not know whether that might, just be offensive if I express something of that sort to someone like you. So that would be an honest confession from my
I
side.
eased your mind today, Pragya.
Yeah.
That's what comedians do. They come, they make you really uncomfortable, and then they make you happy.
Thank you so much. So moving on, I also know that you really like watching movies, or you really like pop culture from your talks, because you give a lot of examples from pop culture. And pop culture is a very, very significant part of the public sphere. A lot of our behavior in public spaces are shaped by pop culture influence and whatever is we see on televisions, on Netflix, and all of these things. But when it comes to representation of people with disabilities in pop culture, I will go back to a point that you mentioned, that it's always there is this sense that the society tries to say that at least there is some representation, right? They keep on saying things like, okay, this director might have made a flawed representation of people with disabilities, but just be happy with that representation, because at least there is someone making a film. So there is this continuous push to just be content with the little that we see, that little representation that people with disabilities might find themselves in pop culture. My question would be that how do you think that then Bollywood, or in general, say, mass media, can do better in these regards, rather than just try to either demonize in some pop culture representation, or again that sort of inspiration porn kind of representation that we often see? Like, is can we find better representation, and if we can, how can we do so?
Just everything. We have to settle for at least on everything, right? Like, this is a constant narrative. Like, hey, don't worry. At least this is there. This is a start. Like, for years, we've only been starting what's really happening, right? But I think it's interesting, pop culture representations of disability are very gradually increasing, although flawed. I'm contradicting myself. But it's interesting because I feel like, I don't know what to say. Sorry, I can take up the whole episode with this pop culture piece. One, I use a lot of pop culture examples because that's what people understand. There was this parliamentarian who basically said, after watching Tare Zameen Par, we really know what dyslexia means, right? And I was like, yeah. And a lot of people started coming up to like parents with dyslexic kids and said, but your kid must be an artist, some form of an art or the other. And you're like, just shut up. So it's also very interesting because I hope people don't think after Kabul I can start like jumping from 10 feet and killing people and having superhuman whatever, right, ability to respond to sound and smell and things like that. So I think what we're representing, the problem is pop culture is pervasive, right? And people really believe. People shape their understanding, their beliefs, their exposure. And it's a circle. The beliefs shape pop culture, and the pop culture heavily shapes the beliefs. But it's also very interesting because nobody says, oh, this is a film where there's a hero, at least there's a man. Why is it such a given that there will be a hero in every film, right? uh, and that's okay. Nobody has to tell them this representation. Like they never have to be like, "Acha, humko bhi to le aao, please," right? And so it's very similar to like, okay, but what diversity of men are we showing? Even if we look at men and their diversity, forget about women and their diversity. We're not showing diversity. The problem with pop culture is lack of diversity. Now there are biopics that have come up very recently, but I'll give you a few examples and you tell me how. I mean, or just think about how it reflects. Right? Let's start from my favorite director, Sanjay Leela Bhansali's films, and I have hated each of his films with like a different vigor or passion. But Khamoshi, where the young child who's non-disabled and her deaf parents are like using her to um, further their employment, and she from a young age, poor thing, has to like really support them, and this, invoking this pity for the parents but also the child, right? And then you move to films like Black, and then films like Mun, right? And you say, where is this going? The non-disabled child is a poor thing, the non-disabled partner is a poor thing, and disability is such a burden, and that's a constant narrative in Sanjay Leela Bhansali's films, right? That disability is a burden in of itself on society, on families and partners and romantic relationships and familial relationships in general, right? And from there we move to movies like Zero, where the woman on the wheelchair could be a very, very accomplished scientist, but she has to prove her worth by picking up a pen. It's I don't know what level of ridiculousness is this, right? It's also to say that you could be someone who went to the moon and came back, but if you don't know how to make like rajma chawal, you're really not worth it. I don't understand, but sure, I mean.
That's actually a really relevant example now that I think about it. Even what was that film with Hrithik Roshan? That was also a Sanjay Leela
Whole
Bhansali
million.
film. No,
Oh,
no, no, no.
Guzarish. Kills
Guzarish.
himself.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
of
Guzarish
course. Didn't I
also.
say they're all burdens?
Yeah,
We're all
yeah.
a burden. I'm so sorry, girls. No, but also like books and everything, right? Books about everyday life. And I was reading this very fantastic book. Let me end at a positive note on popular culture, right? I was reading this beautiful book recommended by a colleague of mine, A Quiet Kind of Thunder. And it's just a teenage love story.
Mhm.
And this teenage love story has a deaf young boy and a young woman who has selective mutism and high anxiety. And that's it. And they have their own challenges, but they also have their moments, and they also fight, and they also are jealous. And um, it's so important to just see disabled people in our everyday lives. And I think that's what's missing. How many children's books have disability? Fairy tales, so forget it. But like, how many children's books have disability? How many young adults? How many teenage romances have disability? How many suspense thrillers have disability where it's not the scarred villain, or like this limping footprint leaving like a mark, you know, in just your everyday interaction? I think that's exactly what's missing. And just to say that at Rising Flame, we'll next year hopefully have the publication out. We just a 3 month long workshop, 3.5 month long workshop called My Tale Too, where women with disabilities from across South Asia came together and reclaimed the narratives. So they rewrote Disney fairy tales. And so we have an autistic ugly duckling, we have a deaf Snow White, and so on and so forth. So yeah.
that is such a great thing to like. I think it was first the feminist perspectives who wanted to rewrite the very patriarchal what stories, what are those princess stories and everything, and now there is more. So I think gradually we
But that's
are.
exactly, Pragya, I want to ask that when we were doing feminist rewritings, how many
Hmm,
of us did intersectional feminist rewritings? Like,
that's
why do women with disabilities have to do a disability rewriting?
yeah,
We're also
yeah.
doing a feminist and disability. I don't know what they did, right? We just reclaimed fairy tales. So I'm not saying that it's a disability reclamation. I'm just saying that as women with disabilities, we just reclaim fairy tales. And I think this is a classic example of how we could be a little more intentional. Inclusion just by saying for all doesn't help, because everybody may not have the same access to opportunities, right? So everybody may not be able to be there at a feminist retelling. But can we, as privileged feminists, putting myself in that space, right? I'm a disabled feminist and I say I'm privileged. So can we, as privileged feminists, think of that one more step of intersection?
Thank you for pointing that out, because that leads me to my next question. And that is basically, say, the feminist movement, even like every other movement, has its own flaws. To be honest, there are certain people who are leading it, and there are certain people who are pushed back, and their voices are just left unheard. My next question is about how do you think, and do you think actually that the feminist movement in India has been aware and active about the specific challenges that people with disabilities face, and has the mainstream feminist movement, and here mainstream, you know how I am trying to define it, the ones who get most of the space available, do you think that they have done anything to acknowledge these intersectionalities? And if there are contemporary issues that you think that do not get highlighted even within such liberal spaces, when it comes to, say, questions of accessibility of people with disabilities and disability rights?
So this is, the feminist movement is so vast and so diverse that I cannot say the entire movement is like this, right? There are actors from within the movement who are really supportive of disability rights. There are some actors within the movement who think that tokenistic inclusion is good. And that's why they're comfortable leaving it. And there's some actors who are like, oh, they can all be put on like one marginalized voices panel. And it's amazing because, no, that's still tokenistic inclusion. Spaces where they're like, Acha, this is not a disability issue, so let's not even invite them, right? And I think it's really about who are you, in which space do you stand, and how sensitive as an actor within the feminist movement, as a feminist within the feminist movement, right? It really is dependent on that. It's really dependent on which organization do you represent and what's their organizational commitment. If you come from an organization space, if you come from an individual space, the excuses are far lesser, because then you cannot say that we had barriers within the organization, etc. Those who are leaders within the organizations, those who are leaders within the movement, what happens is when you're a leader, the onus on you increases. So it may not be that you may be not doing something, or doing something but not enough. It's because you're the leaders. It's automatically on you to then be proactive, to then say whose voices are we not hearing, right? And an example from 2 years ago, where Me Too really went like, I don't know what to say, right? The second wave, the first wave, the second wave, at each wave in India, I didn't see any mainstream feminist leaders who really were supporting, and all of us were supporting the women who came out in Me Too, right? And we were really happy and sad at the same time. Women were speaking up, sad because the spaces were still not safe for them to speak up, looking at, also experiencing their stress, etc. But I didn't see the leaders stand up and say, oh, why don't we hear enough of accounts from, let's say, the disability movement? Why aren't we disability speaking up? Is it possible that we say all women face harassment and then disabled women would not face harassment? Is it really possible? Let me tell you, it's not, right? And so it's not active exclusion, but it's also lack of active inclusion. Now, to go back to the folks, and I always say that at some point of time, some of us became really close, because like every panel, it was me, it was Hasina Khan and one other person, and now Priyanka and I share the same, like it's just, either it's a feminist from the disability movement, then a Muslim feminist, then a Dalit feminist, a disabled feminist. We're all put on a panel and they're like marginalized voices. You look at any conference, classic panel called Marginalized Voices. And we met so often in 2 years that I was like, oh my God, here we are, the marginalized voices. And we all were laughing at it, right? How is it that disabled feminists would not be able to speak on economic empowerment? Do you really think that there's no issue around economic empowerment and that they don't tie into the larger economic empowerment issues? So that's my question, that what we're doing in many spaces is we are putting away people around their identity. We're saying, Acha, you're disabled and Muslim, no, two people. Now you speak in like marginalized voices. Or like we'll keep a special session for you. Let's do accessibility as a special session. But let's not put accessibility in the public access session. Why? And I think the biggest tension that we have not addressed, and this is an issue that I'm centering right now, is the termination of pregnancy. Termination of pregnancy of disabled women. And we don't really care. The Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act, how many feminists who work on abortion rights know this? And I know a bunch of them who know it because we work very closely together. But how many know that in the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, direct loophole where pregnancies could be terminated without the consent of a disabled woman, right? In cases of X disabilities where X is not defined. It's, so we can't be actors working on abortion rights if we're not inclusive enough then. It's a very cheesy example, like a saying, but I'll still say it because inclusion does not mean calling someone to your party. It's about inviting them and then dragging them onto the dance floor to dance with you, right? So it's not just, oh, it's open, you come. It's not just, oh, the dance floor is all yours, you also dance. It's about dancing with them, right? And that I think is very important in our feminisms as well. And on the note of Me Too, by the time it will be up, we would be publishing, and Feminism in India had published the first Indian account of Me Too, a formally article, and Rising Flame has taken this up this year globally, and from 3rd December onwards, we are going to be publishing about 6-7 global accounts of Me Too that women with disabilities have stood up and said, and particularly from within the disability movement as a closed community. So do watch our website, do read the articles. If you haven't attended our webinar on sexual harassment and Me Too on December 7th, it will be available on our YouTube as well.
Nidhi, we're coming towards the end of this episode, and a lot of very interesting things have been brought up that kind of leave us with a lot to think about in terms of our attitudes, in terms of our feminist activism, and just a lot, honestly, to think about. Before we wrap up, this is like a sort of like a cheesy question that has to be asked to everybody. The road to accessibility, coming back to what we started this conversation with, is a long one. And looking at the way that things are today, people are working towards it, but it does seem to be a while away. But could you tell us what are some immediate steps that we can take as citizens, as well as those in power, to reach this goal sooner?
Again, citizens are very many in this country. We're a very large population, so we can't have blanket things. But I'll still speak to the actors within different spaces, right? If you have a conference, you can just have a category saying, do you live with a disability? Would you need a reasonable accommodation? If you can't print an agenda in Braille, for example, provide human assistance, give that e-copy. There are ways to figure out. Take that little extra step, a little quote unquote inconvenience that people call it, right? If someone is with a speech difficulty, allow them the time to make their presentation. Like, no, we are in a fireside chat. You only have 5 minutes. God, no, right? I mean, why would someone with a speech difficulty have to tell you that, hey, can I get that 2 minutes extra because I speak slowly? If somebody else comes and says that, hey, I've not outed this, but I have anxiety issues, can I just take a minute more? Understand that, right? And I think just trying to build our empathy, just trying to see that there are visible and invisible diversities that people come with, that we all occupy spaces. And I think just thinking about this space as ours, to remember that this space doesn't belong to you or me. This space belongs to us. So never think that you're creating this space for others. This space is anyway there, right? And I think just by shifts in these two attitudes and behaviors, we as first steps would become really inclusive, really accessible, and really safe. I can't tell you how many folks who work with us, not just like work within the team, but for workshops, right? We've had feedback in every workshop, trainings, webinars that we conduct that everything's so accessible. We never thought it could be so accessible. Thank you so much for making it accessible. And I really I smile, but I also want to cringe that people with disabilities still have to say thank you for making things accessible. We never went, like, how many of us have written emails to Zoom and to WebEx for making this digital world accessible? Nobody. We take it as a right that this is a business, we are the clients, right? But people with disabilities are constantly grateful that you made this accessible. I think that needs to go away. We need to come to a point as a society and as a movement that we don't make anyone feel grateful to just have an access to something. And this cuts across identities across like the whole intersectionality discourse. But really, I mean, if we don't start here, we're never going to start.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. I keep thinking about this a lot, that I don't think this 35 minutes of a podcast can sum up everything, and it can't. It really can't. But I think you have sparked so many ideas and so many perspectives. And I hope that this episode will only be a conversation starter, but we will not stop there. And we will talk about other issues. Like you mentioned, SRHR is so important. We have to become more aware of the intersectionality when we do our campaigns, when we make our blueprints about how we are going to conduct workshops, who are we going to invite for our panels and everything. So thank you so much for being there and for giving us so many real life examples and your favorite Bollywood examples. They are so insightful. So thank you.
I wish to meet Sanjay Leela Bhansali one day. I've publicized him so much on his bad films. I'm so sorry.
Oh, I hope to.
I can't hear for your set after you met him, honestly. Yeah. But again,
he might offer me one of the pity-inducing disability roles. Or awe-inspiring. I'm so sorry. There's the other side as well.
Thank you so much for being here with us today, Nidhi. I think I can safely say on both like mine and Pragya's behalf that this has been one of the most, we can't really say fun because you talk about so many important things, but I'm still going to go out and say it. This has been one of the funniest, most fun episodes that we've done till now. So thank you so much for taking out the time to be here with us today. It was a genuine pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. It was amazing speaking with both of you. I really enjoyed myself. Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of this episode of Intersectional Feminism Desi Style. Like always, Pragya and I would love to know what you thought of this episode. So do write into us with any feedback or comments that you have. And join us next Thursday. We are going to be talking about how men can benefit from feminism and how patriarchy is not just about quote unquote women's issues. So I think that's going to be a rather interesting episode. So do make sure that you tune in for that one. And thanks so much for listening to us today.